and leave us in ours. But occasionally when we're getting near the edges, or they're coming out near the edges, we do see them. But, okay, if what I'm saying is true, then we're humans. We ought to be able to just mount up and go in and get one anytime we want, right? If we're really serious about it, we should be able to do that. It's not quite as easy as you think. Next slide. The panda is a perfect example of that. The panda was the Bigfoot, or the hominoid, of the 18th century. These rumors used to come out of China of a black and white bear that ate bamboo, and every expert knew that was a crock. Bears were black or brown or white, but they weren't two-toned, and they were all carnivores, so they weren't taken seriously at all. And of course, the reports were coming from uneducated natives, and so what did they know about anything? Until 1869, when a French naturalist went to China, saw the hide of one hanging on a wall and knew that they were a fresh killed hide and knew that they were real. So he sent the word out, and every zoo and museum sent teams into Sichuan province, China, an area about the size of Arizona, and team after team went in to try to bring out the first panda. And these were serious people who really knew how to make their way in the woods. And the area where the panda comes from is rugged terrain, like where the hominoids live, but covered with bamboo forest instead of trees, but essentially the same kind of area. Now, how long do you think it took to bring out that first panda? And don't answer those of you that know. How long do you think it took? 60 years. 60 years. Now, surprising, isn't it? But it really didn't take that long. I'm exaggerating. They looked for only about 30 years, and then they gave up. They said it had to be impossible. And 30 years later, Teddy Roosevelt's sons are out there doing some hunting, and they kill one. And they know that, again, they're real. And then they mount up, and over the next 15 or 20 years, they bring in a half a dozen or so. But even to this day, it is still very hard to go into the wilds of Sichuan province and bring out a wild panda. Why? Well, what's the panda doing to make it so hard? Look at it. It's good sized, it's brightly colored, it's slow moving, it lives during the day, it eats a very restricted diet, it's as stupid as a bag of hammers, it doesn't do anything. It just lives. The terrain is what defeats us. The terrain is what defeats us. So imagine going out into that same kind of terrain, a creature that's big, fast, mobile, omnivore, operates mostly at night, is nocturnal, in its own environment, sees better than us, hears better than us, smells better than us, and in its own environment, it will think better than us. It will stay away. But despite all that, there are still accidental sightings, and there have been a lot of them, and there have been captures, and there have been killings, and there have been enslavements. Now, we're going to go over some of the best of those stories. All right, this is the famous Roger Patterson film of 1967. This is a slide taken from it. You have all seen that film at one time or another. It is a very famous film, probably second only to the Kennedy assassination as far as analysis, trying to figure out how it could have been faked. Every time someone studies it, they always come to the same conclusion: it's probably real for a number of reasons. Sun is shining very brightly. We can see her muscles moving in her shoulder and in her thighs. We can see her muscles snapping under her skin. If that's a person in a suit, you have to glue the suit to the skin to get that look, and then you lose the ripple effect. The only living flesh on living muscle makes that look. So we know right away, we don't have to look any further, that's real. Notice, too, the arms, the extension of the arms carry them down around her knees. She has that extraordinary length. Remember the upper arm of the Homo erectus? You remember the Homo erectus boy? The extraordinary length of his upper arm? She has that. She has an elbow joint that moves here, articulates perfectly, as we can see, but it's not where a human in a suit would be. There's no way that's a person in a suit with that elbow articulating where it is. The breasts also move perfectly naturally. You wouldn't get that effect in a suit. And she leaves footprints that sink an inch into the sand, and they put 200-pounders walking right beside it, and they sank about a quarter of an inch, so we know she weighed 600 to 800 pounds. Very hard to fake that. And then Patterson knew what he had, so he went out and he called for dogs and experts to come to the site. Had a perfect sighting. No expert would come. Remember I told you they won't come? They won't come. Nobody would bring dogs. The two things you don't want if you're faking one of these things, one of these films, is experts and dogs. Because the experts can measure a tree limb and know how tall the thing was relative to that. And dogs, these things have a very powerful negative body odor. Stinky. And dogs, even hunting dogs, will recoil from that. If it's a person in a suit, the dogs are right out after it, no problem. So the people who fake these things can't tell you exactly where it happened. They can't ever lead you right back to the spot for that reason. Patterson did everything right that he could do in 1967 except film a creature that could be real. That's all he did wrong. Next slide, please. This is a man named Albert Ostman, picture taken in 1957. He's telling a story to John Green that occurred to him 33 years earlier in 1924 when he was a young timber cruiser in southern British Columbia. He was camping out on a gold mining expedition on a holiday. He was looking for lost gold mines, and he's sleeping in his sleeping bag one night when a Bigfoot picks him up, shoves him to the bottom of the bag, throws the bag over his shoulder like Santa's bag of toys, picks up his camp stores with the other hand, and marches off with him. And carries him for about an hour and dumps him out in a 10-acre basin surrounded by rock walls, and he's over on one end of it, and the only opening is at the opposite end. And a family of Bigfoot have him. The male that got him, his mate, an older female, and two offspring, a young male and a young female. And Ostman has to stay with them for 6 days before he can figure a way to escape. It's a very funny, very amusing, long story, but I've got it in the book. You'll enjoy it if you get the book. But the point is, he does finally get away, and he doesn't tell anybody for 33 years. He's ready to take it to his grave when he reads an affidavit in a newspaper about a Canadian who had seen one picking berries, and he was asking for people out there who could offer some corroboration. Ostman told him, yeah, it happened to me. And then when everybody found out his story, of course, they just descended on him. Experts and people made him take lie detector tests and all that. You know how it is when you're telling a long, complicated lie, especially if you're old and your memory's going a little bit, you're going to screw up the details. Never did. He always told the same consistent, solid story, and judged by anybody that knows anything about it to have been telling the truth, and I believe it was. And I think if you read his story, you'll agree too. Next slide. Okay, this is the famous Minnesota Iceman. Minnesota Ice Child is more like it. It was an adolescent Bigfoot, it looks like, shot and killed by a man named Frank Hansen in the woods of northern Minnesota, ironically in the same year that Patterson took his film. This is 1967. Shot it in the back, as you see, blew out this nice big hole in its chest, seems to have severed its spine and dropped down. He walked up to finish it off. It lifted its left arm to protect its face. He shot it right through the wrist, right through the left eye, blew the right eyeball out of the head, and of course blew out the back of his head. Now, if Frank Hansen had been a different kind of man, the hominoid question would be over in 1967. All he had to do was take this body and cram it down the throat of science, and that would be the end of it. But he wasn't that kind of guy. The kind of guy he was he bought a 7-foot floor freezer, he dumped it in there, he filled it up with water, he froze it, he put a sheet of plate glass over the top of it, he put it in the back of a Mack truck, and he took it around to county fairs and shopping malls all around the country for about a dozen years. Now, charging a buck a head. Now, as you know, when you freeze something, it doesn't stop its decay, it just slows it way down, so it only got about a dozen years out of it. But in that time, he made a fortune. He certainly got some of my money. Did he get the money of anybody else in here? Anybody else see it besides me while it was out there? I generally get one in every crowd. Nobody here. Well, anyway, I did see it when I was a young man with perfect vision, and it was well known at the time. And what he did when he was trying to get some publicity started about it, he let a man named Ivan Sanderson, who was the man in the field of cryptozoology at the time. Ivan Sanderson had 3 days with it to study it in the ice. And he did so. And he wrote an extremely detailed technical report, a lot of which I quote in the book. And you will see if you read it that Ivan Sanderson knew what he was talking about. He was a true zoologist, so he knew it in technical terms. But I can just tell you in layman terms that it was the real deal for this reason. You could see the hair. You know how hair floats in water? You know hair floats. Well, its hair floated up off its skin, and you could see where every hair went into the pores, especially around the knees, because it was taller than 7 feet. So the knees were jacked up very near the ice. You could have bad eyes and see that. And these hairs are not like our hairs. They're like, you know, primate hairs. They're long, circular, and they go into the pores, and they fit perfectly tight around every pore, millions of them. You could see them, and they all slanting the right way in each, wherever part of the body they were. immaculately accurate. And anybody that works, and what we're told, of course, by science is that this was a rubber and wax dummy just used by a guy like P.T. Barnum to make money. Well, anybody that works in a wax museum will tell you that putting hair is the hardest thing to make it look realistic, because you have to punch it in with an instrument, and then you have to pull the instrument out so it leaves a little gouge mark by each hair. There were no gouge marks on the hair of this. Each one was perfect. You could see that. An idiot could see that. But furthermore, the wounds, that's what really impressed me, the wounds. Each of the wounds, it had already pretty much bled out by the time he put it in the freezer, but it was still oozing plasma from its wounds. You know how when you scrape your elbow real bad, even after it stops bleeding, it oozes that kind of white stuff mixed with blood? It's sticky, right? Well, that's what this thing was doing. It was oozing plasma from every one of its wounds as the water froze. So you had these tendrils coming up from this hole, from the wrist. You could see bones, by the way, sticking out of that. Out of both eyes, out of both nostrils, and out of the corners of the mouth. And as you know, if you suffer a severe head injury, you're going to bleed out of your nose and out of your mouth as well. And it suffered a pretty severe head injury, being a bullet through its head. So what happened was these tendrils were coming out of the wounds up to the surface of the ice in these thin ribbons, because they would hold together because of that stickiness of the material, of the plasma. And they would go up to the surface of the ice, and they would make these little circles at the top, pink. So you can see these pink ribbons coming from the deepest part of the wounds right up to the top of the ice. Couldn't miss it. Now, I defy you to even think of this, much less execute it if you're creating a wax and rubber dummy. And the real deal again. Next slide, please. Now, perhaps the most interesting one of these cases, and this will be the last one, is Zana from Russia. Now, Zana was an almas, not a Bigfoot, an almas. Remember the one I said, living Neanderthal, man-sized, 5 to 7 feet tall, 300, 600 pounds? Well, they're found in the mountains of southern Russia for the most part, in western China. That's where they dominate. Now, when they find them and catch them and kill any kind of hominoid, Bigfoot, alma, agawai, whatever, in China, they kill it, they desiccate its bones, and they sell that body parts and bones for medicines, principally aphrodisiacs. Very valuable there. But in the Russian area where these things come from, when they were captured, the males were used as slaves for heavy labor because they're so strong, and the females would be used for heavy labor as well in a village or wherever they were kept, and as sex objects for the men in the area. And this is what the fate that befell Zana. Now, the research was done on her. She died in 1890. She had spent her life in a village in Russia from about 1840. When she died, in 1965, when the research was done, this was an area of Russia where very long-lived people exist. There were still over 100 people over the age of 80 that had known her when they were young. So they got terrific corroborative evidence about her and her life from this very wide range of people who could tell them consistently the same story about her. And the story they told is this, that she came to the village as an adult. They don't know how old she was, around 1850. It took them 3 years to break her spirit and tame her. They just kept her chained in a hole and fed her, and she lived in that hole for the whole time she was there. She couldn't stay in a heated room. No hominoid can. They're not adapted to it. So she finally was broken enough to where they could just let her roam around, and they could teach her to do chores, which they did. Mostly fetch and carry water, go out and collect firewood, and bring it in. And she could understand the language, and she's not the only case that we have, so understand what I'm telling you is well documented, that they can learn the language, just like Coco can learn the language. Go get wood, go get water, do this, do that. They know, they understand, but they can't speak, because the hominoids have that throat problem. They're primates. See it right here in the drawing of it. She could not speak. But she could learn the language, and she did. Now, the most interesting thing about her is that in her 40 years, again, she died in 1890, she was there for 50 years. No, excuse me, 40 years, I'm sorry, from 1850 to 1890, about 40 years she was there. In those 40 years, she gave birth 8 times to hybrids with the men of the village. 4 of those lived to adulthood as Russian citizens. They married Russian citizens, and she has grandchildren and great-grandchildren alive in Russia to this day. I know that's incredible, but that is the way it is. Now, what do they say about her children? Well, all the same. They were taller than most, but not giants. They were much stronger than most, but not superhuman. They had arms a little longer than most. They had skin much darker than most, but not black.